Well, welcome everybody to the University of Arizona's Water Resources Research Center Brown Bag Seminar webinar. We've been doing these as webinars since March now, and we're really excited to have Dr. Sharon Megdal giving this upcoming presentation in just a moment. My name is Claire Zucker. I'm the Associate Director at the Water Resources Research Center, and I'm just going to share a bit about our center. We are a unit within Cooperative Extension here at the University of Arizona, and we're also a federally authorized Water Resource Research Institute for Arizona and part of the National Institutes for Water Research. Our mission, should you want to know, which I'm sure you do, is to both enrich understanding and empower informed decision making on key water policy and management issues through engagement and education and applied research. So that's what we like to do. We have between 15 and 20 webinars now. They're on webinar, but brown bag seminars in most of the year. During the academic year cycle, we're closing out our cycle right now, and this is the final presentation for this year. When you're enjoying this webinar, I hope that you'll have questions, and you can see on the box on side of your screen a place to enter questions, not the chat, but the questions. Go ahead and enter them in there at any time. We're going to take the questions at the end of Dr. Megdal's presentation, and we'll have about 15 minutes for that at that time. So I'm going to start by introducing Dr. Megdal. She is here, the director of the University of Arizona Water Resources Research Center, and she's also a researcher at the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, and her work focuses on water policy and management. She holds many titles, which I won't go into, but she has a very broad scope of work, ranges from local to international. And she has projects that include things such as comparative evaluation of water management, policy and governance in water scarce regions, groundwater recharge, and transboundary aquifer assessments. Today, her presentation is going to touch on many of those things. And the title of today's presentation is Developing Pathways to Solutions to Wicked Water Problems. Welcome, Dr. Megdal.
Thank you, Claire. And good day, everybody. I know some people it may be evening for them in different time zones. It's noon here in Tucson. And I'm in my office right now. I came in to use the good speed internet because it's not so reliable at home, but like most of us, we're still closed. The office is closed. We only come in when necessary. And it really is my pleasure to speak with you today. It's a little unusual. I did one of these last week where you don't get to see your audience. You don't get any kind of feedback. So I'll just be talking to you and going through slides. I plan to be finished a few minutes before 1, if not before then. And what I'd like to do is tell you about my outline and then get into the seminar. First, I want to talk a little bit about why I'm giving this seminar. There's a little interesting story behind that. Provide some context that I typically do for all the lectures I give and in my class, graduate class in water policy in Arizona and semi-arid regions. Then I want to talk about what are we talking about when we talk about wicked water problems. What are they? And then the next two items I kind of combine together, which are exploring some problems. I'll identify some, and then talking about the pathways to solutions to them. And then I'll wrap up talking a little bit about this concept that's in the title about bridging through water, or in my cover photo rather, and the value of sharing lessons learned. And then finally, some concluding remarks. So again, thank you all for being here with me today. And just the motivation behind this. I was on sabbatical this semester. In fact, today's the last day of classes here at the University of Arizona. And my plan for my sabbatical was, as shown on the slide, a water policy and management lecture tour. And the idea was that I've experienced a lot of interest in some of these topics listed here: Arizona water management, groundwater governance and management, transboundary aquifer assessment, Colorado River Basin water issues, comparative analysis in water scarce regions, and then this concept of wicked water problems and bridging through water. And so I had a nice series of lectures scheduled, and then COVID-19 hit. And in fact, I was scheduled to be in Australia right now for about 2 weeks, giving 6 to 8 lectures over there. And my idea was I was going to go visit places based on invitation. And I got to 2 very exciting places. I got to Singapore in January, as you can see. And the idea was I would be giving 1 or more lectures in each place, come back and share some reflections, and go on and do some local lectures in state within the US. So I got to Singapore at the very early part of March. I got over to the Middle East, to Israel. And I even thought about, should I go or not go? And this was really still, we weren't quite sure what COVID-19 was really meaning. And so I got there, and instead of being there for almost 2 weeks, I was there for 3.5 days and came back. And so here I am. And instead of being in Australia this week, I'm actually delighted to share some thoughts with you about wicked water problems and pathways to solutions. So in terms of context, this is a slide I typically use in my first class meeting and many presentations to just remind everybody that what we see kind of on the ground in the water in terms of how water's managed, the water quality, quantity, distribution, really reflects a lot of things. And I'm not going to read the whole list to you. You can look at it while I'm speaking. But I did underline a couple of things, and that is the legal framework is very important to what we see happening. And sometimes things might not seem logical, and that might be a reflection of the law, because in certain cases, for example, the law does not recognize the connection between surface water and groundwater. Yet we know in our natural systems they are connected. And then another factor that's very important as to what we see is just who's making the decisions. Is it very centralized? The United States is a large country. A lot of the authority for management is actually delegated to the states and then further delegated from there. In other instances, it may be very centralized. And then, of course, values, socio-cultural factors are all very important. And then some additional context I've already mentioned is the water cycle. I particularly like to use this graphic, which was from one of our older water map posters. In the background there, Claire, when she made the introduction, is a poster that's our current water map poster for Arizona. And the reason I like this one, and if you can see my arrow cursor here, is because it shows groundwater as water interspersed in materials, not some pristine underground lake. But we have to remember no new water is created. It may change form, quality, move around, but what we have is what we have. And then the geographic context is very, very important. Here's a map showing the southwestern United States with the boundaries of the Colorado River Basin. You can see Arizona, the state we are in, is right here. It's almost wholly within the Colorado River Basin boundaries. This is a river that is highly managed, supplies water in some form or another to estimated 40 million people in 7 states in the United States and the Republic of Mexico. Water is also conveyed from within the basin boundaries outside to Los Angeles, to agricultural areas in California, Salt Lake City, up in Utah, Denver, Albuquerque. It's a heavily utilized river. It's an iconic river. And many of you, if I were in a room with people, even around the world, I'll always ask, how many of you have been to Hoover Dam? This is a photo of Hoover Dam. The river forms the boundary here between the states of Arizona and Nevada. I've got it circled up there. And it's been a very highly used and stressed river system. I also show here the United States and Mexico and the international border between the two countries. That's very relevant to what we see in terms of water use and water management. And then one more map or set of maps is showing the sovereign tribal nations in the Colorado River Basin that have rights to Colorado River water off of the main stem river. And then on your right is a map of Arizona showing in this goldish color the tribal nation lands within the state of Arizona. And we have over 20 tribal nations, most of them with land areas. And I'm going to come back a little later to talk a little bit about the Navajo Nation. So keep this in mind. It's very large, bigger than many individual states in the United States. And these nations are sovereign. And so we're sharing borders with nations within our states sometimes, as well as a nation such as Mexico. And I'm also going to talk today about the Middle East, and this is the region I'm focusing on: Israel, the Palestinian territories, the West Bank here, the Gaza Strip. I'll mostly focus on the West Bank, and then Jordan. So here's the geography that I'm focusing on for today's lecture. Now, this is another background slide that I show a lot, and I'm not going to go through this long list, but this is maybe a sampling. I don't assert that it's comprehensive, but these are some of the many, many water issues that water professionals of all types are working on. And I used to call it my water management issues and challenges slide, but within that, the list are solutions. So for example, desalination is a solution, but it has issues of cost and brine disposal, for example, associated with it. The one immediately under recycled water for potable and other water needs. It's a solution. It also has a lot of issues and matters that have to be dealt with. There's a lot of uncertainty that we deal with all the time. We're not going to ever be in a situation of perfect information and complete information. So moving now to this concept of wicked water problems. And I have to thank Lisa Butler, a colleague from the state of California. And Lisa, if you're out there listening, hi, and thank you. Lisa was a speaker at the Water Resources Research Center's annual conference in 2016. And she introduced many of us at that time to this concept of wicked water problems and drew on some of the philosophical literature on wicked problems and then connected it to water. And so this slide and the next pulls out some information she shared. We asked her to write a column for us afterwards, which she kindly did. And this on the right is the column she wrote. But what she said was that more and more water problems seemingly defy standard solutions. And she offered 4 reasons for that. And take a look at that. I'm going to repeat them a few slides down. Incomplete or contradictory knowledge, the number of people and opinions involved, large economic burdens, and then the interconnected nature of these problems with other problems. And she talked about they're often tossed back and forth. They're sometimes too substantial for grand solutions. Maybe you can't even talk about them being solved. They're only mitigated or eased. I put in the underlining of interdisciplinary collaboration is required. Combining all these different kinds of expertise is necessary for effectively changing the situation and moving towards solutions. And she asserted that managing wicked water problems is a new kind of work, and it requires changing the questions, managing uncertainty, and creating resilience. So with that backdrop, if I were in a room with you in person, I might say, what do you think are some of the wicked water problems of the region? And if it were the Middle East, I would do the same. I've done the same. But I can't do that here. So instead, I'm going to offer a few and offer a few that I'll then come back and speak about. So one of them is the problem of groundwater overdraft and the invisibility of groundwater. Unlike surface water that can be more readily seen and measured, that's not the case for groundwater, and much of it's fossil groundwater. And so as we use it, it's not being replenished by nature at the rate at which it's being used. Another is the imbalance of water demand and supply in the Colorado River Basin. Well, that should be the word basin, excuse me, there. And that's a huge issue, not one that just has a single solution to it. And a third one that I'm going to talk about is the lack of attention to water for nature, environmental flows. And so those are just some. I'm sure you could come up with a list of others and many more, but these are ones I'm going to talk about today. And then in the Middle Eastern region of focus, the first set will be talking a bit about lower Jordan River flows and the condition of the Dead Sea. And there's a graphic there on your right that shows the older is to the right, moving to the left, what's happened to the boundaries of the waters of the Dead Sea over time. And there's continuing receding of the Dead Sea. And what's shown here to the south is actually water that's part of potash processing and so forth, where the water's taken from the Dead Sea waters and brought down. And then another set of items that I'll talk about some are wastewater treatment for some areas, water provision and sources for the West Bank and Gaza. I won't speak, as I said, that much about the Gaza. And then water supplies in Jordan. And I'm just, in the short time of this presentation, going to be touching on these matters, and in some cases bringing together information acquired over many visits and work, some of it's very firsthand experience, and some of it's kind of very personal reaction to certain things. And what we're doing here is looking at these in the context of searching for pathways to solutions. So what we're talking about is trying to develop information collaboratively so we can get on the same page with the information. And I show on the right-hand side some output of the Transboundary Aquifer Assessment Program along the border between Arizona, my state, and Sonora, the northern state in Mexico, where we've developed an aquifer assessment report that was in 2 languages. All the maps are in both languages. And it got to a point where we could agree on the technical information. And much of this requires developing partnerships at multiple levels, be it within states and regions, be it across states in a single nation, be it international and including tribal nations. And then the work is considering and implementing options to address the problems or the challenges. And here I list some of those that are widely recognized and talked about. Again, my list is not complete. We're not going to go into all of these today, but I'll just mention desalination, reuse, conservation, water banking, the recharge that Claire mentioned when she introduced me, something I work on, voluntary transactions where it really takes parties to agree to things, rainwater harvesting, greywater systems, and then new ways of designing the built environment, which is something that's been getting more attention in recent years. So back to what I highlighted earlier about what are the reasons for wicked water problems. And because this is only a 1-hour seminar, I'm not going to be able to go into all the cases in great detail. But I ask you to think about these, and I will reflect on some of them as I go through the examples. And I want to mention, as I get into the examples, that there are many, many connections between the regions I discuss. And that is, in fact, the reason I've been engaged in this comparative analysis of water policy and management across these two large regions. Things like water scarcity, thriving agricultural sectors, growing populations. These are shared borders. These are some of the connections. And the pictures that I show will indicate some of them. And the old saying that pictures can say 1,000 words, I may point out some things and others you may pick up as you look through the photos and think, wow, this looks just like my region, but it's the other region. So speaking to some of the cases here in my region where I live, the first one I want to mention is groundwater challenges, particularly in part of central Arizona, a county within the state of Arizona called Pinal County, and that's what's shown here in this yellow area. And the part of the map shown here, which is pulled out of the larger map of Arizona, shows the three counties shown served water by the Central Arizona Project. And the Central Arizona Project is a constructed large conveyance system that takes water from the Colorado River and then pushes it uphill to the highly populated areas of the state, including Phoenix and Tucson, and the largely agricultural area in between the two cities or metropolitan areas. And here the challenge is that there's been long-term drought, climate change implications to the flows of the Colorado River. And so there's more water that's committed to be delivered in the lower basin of the Colorado River Basin, the states of Nevada, California, and Arizona, than can be expected each year. And because the hydrology, the climate conditions have been quite adverse for the last 20 years, with 1 or 2 years of exception, we're in a situation now where deliveries are being curtailed. And the real challenge here in this Pinal County area is that the agricultural entities, I mentioned it's a largely agricultural area, have been highly reliant on the surface waters from the Colorado River delivered through the Central Arizona Project. And now there's a cutback, in a significant cutback in the deliveries available to them. And in order to maintain livelihoods and economic and growing activities, they're having to now revert back to groundwater. And they're going to be investing in some additional wells or refurbishing wells. And the issue here is that the groundwater was already subject to groundwater management through the Groundwater Management Act of the state of Arizona due to overdrafting over a period of time. So there already is quite a bit of localized drawdown, and going back and pumping more groundwater really is meaning more of the fossil groundwater will be used. And at the same time, the area is growing. The communities are growing. It's a vibrant suburb, if I could say, a suburban area of Phoenix. This whole area is called the Sun Corridor. There's a lot of economic activity and potential for growth. And so there's a lot of demand for very limited groundwater. And so the real question is, the problem is, how are we going to meet the demands of the different sectors, the growing urban sector, the existing agricultural sector going forward? And going back to that incomplete or maybe disagreed upon understanding of the information, there's quite a bit of work going on right now to understanding the modeling and identifying the options. But it's not that you can create more groundwater, and so then the economics comes in. Some options may be very expensive. So this is one example. It's very close to home. Another one is the imbalance of Colorado River supply and demand, and sharing the burden of shortage. I already gave you a little bit of comment on the low flows in the Colorado River. This is a photo I took last May 2019, May 20th, I think is the exact date, so almost a year ago. And sometimes the water is already all the way up here, maybe around 1999, 2000 it was. But the storage reservoir behind Hoover Dam has been drawn upon to make up for some of that over allocation and shortfall of the flows. And so that's why at this point, not all expected deliveries can be met. And so there was a very robust process involving all 7 states in the basin. Many of the listeners are very familiar with it, developing these drought contingency plans that will go through 2026. But the shortage sharing guidelines expire at that time. And so there's a lot of work that will be needed to figure out what next. How do we allocate the economic burden of the water, limited water deliveries, and take into account all of the perspectives of the various sectors and players in the process. And so this is going to be something that will be worked on for a number of years now. The work on the Colorado River Basin never ends. And this work is now really a focal point now that we got through the drought contingency plan development. Now, water for nature was the third one that I listed in my slide. And as I thought about what particular example I might use here, I thought about one that would actually connect the 2 regions, the Colorado River Basin and the Middle East region of focus. Back in 2014, there was a conference, an international conference in Israel on the rehabilitation of the lower Jordan River. And I was invited to be a keynote speaker at that and speak to some of the experiences in the Colorado River Basin. And so I did. And I pulled out this slide from my presentation from 2014, stating the goal of the conference is to provide a discussion platform to share lessons and learn from the experiences of others. And that was actually a premise to, or the fundamental premise to, a workshop that I and others organized back in 2009. And it was called the Arizona-Israeli Palestinian Water Management and Policy Workshop. And out of that, we put this volume out, Shared Borders, Shared Waters, Israeli, Palestinian, and Colorado River Basin Water Challenges. And it's quite possible one or more of the other authors in this volume are listening today. And thank you for that and for your contributions. And the premise was, we're dealing with some similar issues. These are 2 of the photos of the different areas. And when we were considering photos to use for the cover, it's like, which one's from the Jordan River and which one might be, in this case, from the San Pedro River. And the particular example I spoke to at that talk was the 2014 pulse flow. Those of you from my region here, may be very familiar with the pulse flow. It occurred for a couple-month period of time where water was specifically allowed to flow south at the border of the US and Mexico and the Colorado River, rather than being diverted westerly for use by agriculture. Some water was allowed to flow to the Delta. And this was a very successful endeavor. And there's a lot one could read up about it. At the conference, I showed the first half of the Robert Redford narrated movie. Here's the YouTube link if anybody hasn't seen it and would like. And it really, I pointed to the how the NGOs and the government officials and others worked so very hard to make this happen. And it was really a collaborative process. And what's interesting about this is that I have people who come up to me when I go to Israel, the Middle East, and say, I remember that talk you gave. That was such an interesting talk. And people don't usually say that to me. And I'll tell you why they remember the talk. And this is why they remember the talk. I showed the movie up until this point of 5 minutes and 25 seconds into it to show this girl smiling because there was water in the riverbed instead of dry sand. And in fact, I remembered exactly where to go when I went to the website of the movie and wanted to snapshot her again. And that shows the joy and happiness that water and natural systems can bring to people. Now I'm going to move to the other region of focus and talk a little bit about the lower Jordan River and Dead Sea conditions. So this is a little snapshot pulled out of that map I showed earlier. And this little blue area is the Sea of Galilee. And from the Sea of Galilee flows the lower Jordan River. The upper Jordan River is fed by natural systems north. It flows in, there are 5 riparians using the Jordan River, and it flows into the Sea of Galilee. And then the lower Jordan flows this very limited distance south until you get to the Dead Sea. And the Sea of Galilee is an important reservoir for Israel, but it is one that's been under stress, much like the Lake Mead is in the Colorado River Basin. And this was a clipping from a few years ago, I believe that's 2017, the Sea of Galilee at lowest level in a century. The flows in have been low. And to me, it's actually remarkable if you look at when we're having a dry winter here in the southwestern United States and the western United States, it's often a dry winter in that part of the Middle East. And unlike some of us who have 2 rainy seasons, their rainy season is basically from November through March. And so there's low inflows, there's a lot of development and demand. And as the river, this picture I put in was one of those that I've taken. And actually, it doesn't look that different from what the Colorado River looks like, let's say in Yuma. I sometimes stay at a hotel that's right by the Colorado River. It's, you know, people talk about the mighty Jordan River. It's very limited in its quantity of water flows, and also the quality has some challenges. And then it's what flows into the Dead Sea. And I show you here 2 pictures of the Dead Sea. On your left is a picture taken from Israel, and it shows the conveyance system taking water out of that northern part to deliver down south to the potash processing basins. And then this photo was taken at one of the resort areas on the Jordan side of the Dead Sea. And, you know, there's just been much receding of shoreline. There have been issues of sinkholes and real problems of infrastructure. Some of the beaches where people used to be able to can call it swim, insert themselves in the Dead Sea, have had to be closed for safety issues and just accessibility. And the Dead Sea is an iconic part of nature, and it's one that's highly threatened. And I'll talk a little bit about something that might mitigate that later on if there's time. But this is clearly one of those things where climatic conditions, development of the water supplies, water quality issues have made for, let's say, not the healthiest of river conditions, and then certainly very limited inflow to the Dead Sea. Now, the West Bank, I'm going to say a few things here. And part of what I'm going to say is, again, a bit of personal reflection. For those who maybe have never visited that region, the area is divided into areas called Area A, B, and C. And those areas distinguish a bit about the administrative structures and security, who's in charge of security for the different parts. And Area A is the part where the Palestinian Authority has the control for all aspects of, you know, government and infrastructure and security. And when I was visiting the region in 2016, with the commissioners, the two commissioners of the International Boundary and Water Commission. We spent a day in the West Bank. We went to Ramallah, and then we went down further south to Hebron. And when we were in the vehicle with the staff from, at that time, it was the Jerusalem consulate, they had a book of maps. And much like we have section maps, these days everybody looks at maps on their phones, but some of us still remember and maybe still have the books of maps where you went from page to page to see the various sections. Well, it's that kind of map. And they were showing us where we were going. And they showed us the shading. And so this color here around Hebron is area A. And what was something I hadn't realized just because I hadn't seen a map like this is that it's almost looking like, I would describe it like Swiss cheese. You've got areas that are connected, and then you've got areas that are disconnected. And so what I want to suggest here is for the Palestinian state that is expected to be formed, the question is, how does water provision work? How does it work economically? And how do systems work when you have this kind of layout of the lands and the territories? And like I said, this was like, wow, I didn't realize this, and maybe I should have. It was my ignorance. But when there's discussion about water provision, and countries like to be responsible for their water supplies, there are some real challenges associated with this and with the infrastructure. On the right here is a reservoir that was built with the involvement and assistance of US aid. And so we visited that. I have to say that one of the commissioners actually climbed up that ladder. I did not. I'm not so good with heights and vertical climbing up ladders, but that's quite a large reservoir for water, and that's very important for the region generally. But there are some major issues here with water infrastructure, continuity of it, wastewater, and the like. Now here's another set of photos that some of which they're from different periods of time. This big one and the one to the right, I'm not sure when I took the one to the right. It may have been back, I think it was back in 2011. This, I know the big one was taken in 2011. This is an area, this is the wall here that's been built between the West Bank and Israel. And this Israeli side is an area called Emek Hefer. And then this is Tulkarem, which is a West Bank city. And this photo up here was taken more recently. That was, I think, taken in 2016 by me. But there are issues here with the wastewater infrastructure, of the flows of waste, different times of the year, let's say during olive processing and the like. And on both sides, there are or have been some needs for improved wastewater infrastructure. And I say there have been. Last I got updated on the Israeli side was probably 2017, but these wastewaters flow across the border. Remember, water doesn't recognize political borders, flow into a stream. There have been issues of pollution of streams on both sides of the boundary and work done on that. And there's opportunity for improvement, but there are also obstacles having to do with some of those other things, that fourth item, factors such as geopolitical factors affecting the ability to address them. All right, water supply in Jordan. I showed the picture above earlier. Jordan is ranked as perhaps the second most water scarce nation in the world. Sometimes I've seen rankings that show it third or fourth. It's very water scarce. It doesn't, other than at the very tip, the northern tip of the Red Sea, doesn't really border like Israel does, the Mediterranean Sea. So there are limited options. The bulk of the population lives in the north. The Red Sea's down in the south. And so if you talk about things like desalination and moving water to where the population is, it's quite expensive. This is an outflow from a large treatment plant. This is the continuation of that outflow. Some of that water then is mixed with surface water and delivered to farmers in the Jordan Valley. And there's this picture here was taken again with the commissioners. It was Commissioner Salmon of Mexico, who still sits as the commissioner, and Ed Racina of the United States. The current commissioner is Commissioner Jane Harkins. This was the then ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Jordan, Alice Wells. This is His Royal Highness Prince Al Hassan bin Talal, who has had a long-term involvement in the water and wastewater infrastructure, a real leader in that regard, and the then Minister of Water and Irrigation at a meeting that was set up, again, to do some of the sharing of experiences and so forth. And it was very interesting to hear and be at the meetings here in Jordan, the Palestinian Water Authority, and talking about the differences of economies and language and so forth, and how at the US-Mexico border, there's been some good and better experiences, particularly in the last 10 or 15 years. This picture down here relates to a project that I became involved in back in 2011 through the Jordanian Royal Scientific Society, invited a few US experts to come in and collaborate. And this was, the whole concept here was at the individual household level to see if there was a way to treat the gray water from the house to then enhance and expand upon some of that mixed surface water, reclaimed water used for the agricultural irrigation in the area. It's a very highly irrigated area. The farmers and their families live on the hills just above the valley. And this was the gentleman with his son put in a solar panel to pump some of the water into ultraviolet. And this was put in by the colleagues from the Royal Scientific Society, some sand filtration and filtration systems. And I want to point out, because this is a similarity with a case I'm going to speak to in a moment, here in the United States, where many of these families are multi-generational families. And this was the gentleman's mother, whom I met a few times, who was doing some weaving outside the home when I was there. This is an example of trying to approach some of the issues of water scarcity, issues of dealing with household wastes. If you put less in the cesspools, there might be less contamination of groundwater, and then you're enhancing and possibly even improving on the water quality of the water used for the agricultural irrigation, but done at the household scale, a very small scale approach. So the last example I want to mention is a very current example, one that's getting a lot of press attention because of COVID-19, but the underlying wicked water problem has been there. And it's the fact that the incidence of COVID-19 in the Navajo Nation is among the highest in the United States, and some of the problems associated with the spread of it and being able to isolate people and wash hands has been directly connected to water accessibility. And I give you here, and we'll be posting the presentation so you can get the link. This was a 8-minute news clip that I caught over the weekend that I thought was provided a good summary of the situation in terms of both COVID-19, but also the issue of water availability, and about 30% of the residents not having water delivered to their homes, not having water plumbing and the like. And this again is the map showing where the Navajo Nation is. And so the issue of energy availability, many of these households are really off-grid. They're not getting electricity off the grid. They're not getting water provided by any kind of water utility. And as I said, this has been an issue for a long time. We have researchers here at the University of Arizona who've been working, again, on small scales, similar to the last example that I talked about, in trying to figure out how to use solar power to develop some pumping capacity and some treatment capacity and the like. And so another example of where there are water availability and water quality issues, the water quality of the groundwater, in a very, very large geographic area where people are very spread out, their houses are very far apart. And so another area or case of there being a lot of effort that will have to go into figuring out, is there a way to approach this that's affordable and can address this? And hopefully the attention to the problems of water accessibility won't go away when we hope the high level of attention to COVID-19 goes away. So having talked about that, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the key factors that contribute to mitigating or addressing some of these wicked water problems. Functioning cooperative mechanisms, very, very important. That's something that I think at that visit in 2017, I think actually it was 16, I think I have a wrong date there, of the commissioners and their meetings, very, very important. Trust and mutual respect. If you're having to work with partners of any type, you have to trust each other and respect each other. Otherwise, it's very difficult to work on developing the solution sets and implementing them. Stakeholder involvement is important, and everybody's a stakeholder, so it's not just key stakeholders, but if you miss some of the people who really have a high level of interest and ability to be involved, that can come back to hurt the implementation. So you really have to create a big table to get people around for the discussions. Good communication, multiple forms of communication. Not everybody wants to read long reports and the like. It's going to take persistence and patience. And again, coming back to those sharing experiences and lessons, both positive and negative, so that we don't repeat mistakes and we can take advantage of the good lessons learned. So I want to just talk for a few minutes here about a recent example of sharing lessons learned. And this was just from this past November at the WATEC conference, Water Technology Exposition in Tel Aviv. And at this panel, we had representatives from the United States, Mexico, and Israel talking about the implementation of technology in a binational setting. And so this is just a summary of the concept of the proposed Red Sea, Dead Sea project. It has been caught up in several geopolitical issues, economic factors. I'm not sure the current status of the tender here, but the idea was that the two countries, Israel and Jordan, would collaborate on the construction of a large desalination project at the Red Sea. Some of the brine would be mixed with further Red Sea water and then distributed to the Dead Sea to perhaps introduce some additional water to the Dead Sea. That plan, was going to be done in a pilot phase to be able to study the implications of doing that. There would be water purchased by Israel in the south. There would be more water provided. There is already water provided from the Sea of Galilee to Jordan in the north by virtue of treaty, and increase that, and also have some water, some desalinated water or water provided to the Palestinian territories. And so an agreement was signed back in 2013 to do this, and there's been some advancement, but also some challenges associated with this. But here's an example. I didn't talk about the successful deployment of desalination technology in Israel because that's a well-known story, and that wasn't the story I was telling today. But technology does have a role to play. And so for this panel, They each had a few minutes to speak. I was the moderator. And the question I asked them to answer, each one of them, was what are the most important variables or factors that contribute to implementing technology across borders? And I gave this as a suggestion, and it goes back to this respect. I had recently before that had the opportunity to think about putting words to important words like trust and respect. And these are some of the things that I suggest are important, many of which I've talked about today. But what did they say? You know, this was my answer, but I asked them there. And so I just want to go through this a little bit. One was eat with your partners, meaning sharing meals with your partners and getting to know them. Functioning relationships. And here I want to just put in a little snapshot photos. It's very difficult to eat with your partners and have functioning relationships when it's very difficult to get together in person. And prior to COVID-19, we in our part of the world here did not have such difficulty seeing people in person. But these two photos are taken, I took back in 2011, and I've since replicated this, where 2 consecutive days I visited the Israel Water Authority and the Palestinian Water Authority. That doesn't typically happen with the Israelis and Palestinians because of some of the barriers to movement. And so some things that we may take for granted or may have taken for granted don't exist in other areas. They said, identify what is beneficial to both nations or parties in order to identify win-win opportunities. And you could have peaks and lows in these relationships and discussions. And you've got to be sincere, understanding different cultures, and be sensitive to each other so things can happen. And again, they came back to noting that eating together was very, very important. So in conclusion, I want to refer back to a statement of Lisa Bueller's that I mentioned earlier. It's a new kind of work, requires changing the questions, managing uncertainty, creating resilience. I'd like to note that technology and economics are both important. Process is extremely important. Continuing education efforts at all levels are important. But I'll ask, this is reflective of where we are right now. When will we be able to meet and eat with our partners? And the photos that I show below, this is the Water Resources Research Center holds an annual conference. This was taken at last year's annual conference. We see many people together just finishing lunch. This was taken with many of our panelists from November, enjoying a very nice dinner in Jaffa. And then this is a photo. I'm not sure if he was able to come on. It's Ramadan. He's got a young family, but this is one of my collaborators on the gray water system, Dr. Ayub Gurar, and his family. And I visited his family for dinner the last time I was in Jordan, which was last April. So you can see mostly happy faces or learning faces here, and we hope to get back to that. So my last slide is reminding everybody that the Water Resources Research Center's conference that was scheduled for March 27th had to be postponed, and we're going virtual, and we're holding it over 2 half days on June 18th and 19th. And it will look at water at the crossroads here. The next 40 years, it's been 40 years since we've adopted some of our effective groundwater management approaches. And now we're going to look forward 40 years and include both surface water and groundwater. And there's more information on our website. And given that it's going to be virtual, anybody from anywhere can attend. So we'd like to invite you to consider attending. So with that, I'd like to say thank you, and I'm certainly happy to take some questions.
All right, thank you so much, Sharon. That was excellent. So many great experiences that you are able to share from your travels. We just appreciate hearing about all those. I was struck part of the way through this, thinking about all of your travels where you are go to these countries as an expert and are brought into these conversations and really valued to you're taking places, and is our structure doing that too? Are we seeing that in Arizona where they're pulling in people from other countries and saying, hey, look at this and give us your expertise? Are you seeing that both ways as we look at these two regions?
Yes, I think the answer to that is yes. But what it takes is knowing people to have these two-way collaborations. So what's very important, I think, for anybody who is doing or wishes to do work is that you really need to do repeated visits. The one-time visit doesn't necessarily establish the relationships that enable you to call upon people and get them to come, but it's definitely a two-way street of sharing information. And there are examples of that all over, very, very common. But it takes keeping in touch with people, that importance of networking, and figuring out where are there the good opportunities. And so, you know, this may seem I'm patting myself on the back, but I do get really excited about this stuff. Just as I brought or I suggested some people from here go to the Middle East in November. A year ago, December 2018, I organized a colloquium at Colorado River Water Users Association, where I brought together panelists from both, in that case, Israel and from the Colorado River Basin to talk about innovations in agriculture and municipal technology. And just tremendous interest. So I really encourage people to look for the opportunities for that cross-fertilization. They're there.
That's great. Speaking of which, you got a greeting from Ramallah City, West Bank, from Rashid Al Sayed. So
Dr. Rashid, good evening to you.
And he asked a couple questions, quite a few actually, but I'm just going to pop down to this first one, which is he mentions that groundwater overdraft and salt intrusion, which is not something we deal with here, are also part of this wicked water problem in the MENA region. I'm not familiar with that. And he says, do you think that practical water solutions warrant further exploration for this kind of issue?
Oh yes, and MENA means Middle East North Africa region.
Oh, I wasn't.
So where there are coastal areas, saltwater intrusion is a serious issue. It's a serious issue in California. I mean, it's not so serious for us in Arizona, but it's the general premise that if you change flows of water, you know, the water flows downhill or it flows in. And so this idea of managing quality of groundwater, whether it be seawater, seawater or saltwater intrusion, or let's say underground pollution plumes. That's been an issue, let's say with the TCE contamination near the airport that we've had people working on. So it's kind of, if you pull one place, there's a push from another. And clearly that's an area where work needs to be done.
Right. Excellent. There's another question here about Governor Babbitt suggesting letting counties deal with groundwater overdraft issues. And would this be realistic? And what sort of transboundary aquifer issues might we create if we have different governance structures at smaller scales?
Well, that's a really good question and a hard question. And when you introduced me, I do a lot of work on water governance, and it's something I think about. It's actually the whole question of what level of government should be doing what was something I studied as a graduate student before I even got involved in water issues. I was more working on tax and expenditure issues. And I think that I'm just going to say a little bit about that. I'm not sure I think that's entirely feasible in our state in, let's say, a blanket way. But what I think is important about the suggestion is that for years, people have said in our part of the country, in our state, we don't think it's a one size fits all. We don't think an active management area for groundwater is right for our area. So let us figure out ourselves what to do. But there has not been a lot of progress in actually accomplishing that. And so I think the idea of looking at sub-state opportunities, regional authorities, and so forth might be a solution, but I'm not sure that translates into doing it at the county level in 15 counties.
Yeah, tricky thought about that. Here's an interesting question. We have quite a few questions here, and thank you everybody for sending those in and for being here. We had over 150 people on this webinar, by the way. Really awesome, so great. We've really enjoyed having the greater reach into the world with these webinars. But here's an interesting question about Israeli billionaire Mirilashvili, who has donated machines to Gaza to produce clean water out of air. And I think you may be familiar with that. But he asks, what about this device? Do you know if there are possibilities for this? I mean, you're more in the end. Perhaps you've heard discussion about this in Gaza and the Middle East, or more generally.
Yeah, so first of all, there are many examples of the gizmos or whatever that are producing water from air. And I have not had a chance to study it enough to know how much, what is the productivity and under what, let's say, climate conditions does it work. Interestingly, that the question of the deployment of such technology came up in the context of some very recent discussions about Navajo Nation water availability. And somebody who knew more than I did, so I'm just basically citing what he said, was it may not work that well when it's colder. And so in climates where you might have a cold winter, like Navajo Nation, that may not work. So I honestly don't know enough about it, but it seems to be working at least to some extent. And given the question, it mentioned the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip has such serious water challenges there. I don't have firsthand knowledge of them, but I've read about them. And they have to do with running out of groundwater, poor quality groundwater because of seawater intrusion, and then some issues that may stand in the way of actually building a desalination plant that could address some of it. So there are some serious issues there. I once reviewed a paper for a public health journal dealing with the water quality and the public health implications of that. And so it's very serious. So when you have such serious problems, that's a good fertile ground for trying some of these technologies out, because anything that improves it is an improvement.
Oh yeah, I wonder if that might be the kind of solution that would work in a more remote setting too, when you have a very dispersed population and you're dealing with other issues such as transporting water. So
right.
We have a question about the environment, and this is one really about Arizona, but maybe you can pull in some of your other experience, which is, how do we address water for the environment? Should it be addressed in the legislature, or as a standalone bill, or as something bigger sustainability package, or how do we even approach that wicked water issue of the environmental water?
It is a wicked water issue because the current laws in the state of Arizona do not really recognize the environment as a water using sector. There might be laws relating to in-stream flows, but back in 2011 or so, and the person asking the question may be familiar, but a few of us wrote a paper basically demonstrating the absence of legislation pertaining to water for environmental needs or riparian systems. It's been a tough one for us to tackle here in the state because the water needed by the people and the industry has been given higher priority. And that's why we see some of the environmental degradation that we see. And so that's one that's truly an example, I believe, and this I'm going to draw from some more general experience, not only local, where people maybe don't believe studies of the valuation that people put on natural systems in the environment. I've been involved in workshops where I've heard called into question the valuation. People, they just don't believe that these valuation studies are reflective of the values.
Yeah.
And then the question is how, you just need to find win-win possibilities. I just happened to notice there was an issue of the Atlantic, an online thing that was, maybe they're doing it for all the states, but they were focusing on scenes from Arizona. And I just flipped through it. I didn't even have time to flip through them all. And one of them showed Fossil Creek. And Fossil Creek is an example of where there was a dam that had been used for power generation that was no longer needed, and it was decommissioned. And now you have really, I haven't visited myself, the pictures are beautiful. You have a natural system of flowing water. And I think it's going to be difficult to get legislation approved unless there's some consensus among numerous entities and groups to make something happen. So I think that's one of those persistence and patience, but the persistence I think really needs to be there.
Yeah. I'm gonna kind of switch tracks here. This is kind of a more broad question that we have, which is how important is it to get the governance, policy, and science right before jumping into mitigation and resolution? Or the alternate side of that question is, do we go ahead and work on some of these solutions and let the policies catch up to us? I'm sure it works both ways. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, first of all, it obviously works both ways. But I remember back in 2003, so I've been at the Water Center here since 2002. And the first annual conference we ran, we did do a couple conferences before I joined, but they weren't necessarily annual, was in 2003. And I remember Carol, it was called Local Approaches to Managing Water Resources or something like that. And I remember Carol Irwin, who was then the head of the Phoenix Projects Office for the Bureau of Reclamation, talk about we don't want to suffer from paralysis of analysis, meaning you never have that perfect information, you never have all questions answered, but you do need some information and you do need some science. And that's why with the Transboundary Aquifer Assessment Program, I mentioned we're getting on the same page with information. Now, is it all the information you need? Clearly not. That was basically taking existing information and harmonizing it and trying to get it all put together in similar units. So you need to get some information, you need to have some science so that you're comfortable enough with moving forward. But that doesn't mean you're going to have all the questions answered. And you probably never will. And that's this whole thing about resilient, let's say resilient solution sets. Lisa Buehler talks about resilience and creating systems that are resilient. And it goes to that whole planning. If something can work in different settings, then it may be okay that you don't know every answer, and you're just not going to know.
Great. I'm looking through these questions. There are quite a few, and they're intricate. So, so here's one. That came in just a moment ago. From the initial slides, you said that the most important factors for determining water policy and management. You talked about those. And I'm assuming that some of these, this person is assuming that some of these priority factors are site specific. But considering your experiences going back and forth, are there some that seem to be running through most of the situations that you're coming across?
Well, I'm not sure I fully understand the question to address it. Clearly, people have, I'll give you an example of where, let's say, socio-cultural values or even religious values may come into play. There are different attitudes, perhaps, about reusing highly treated wastewater, regardless of whether it may be better quality than the other water sources that might be used. And so that's an example of where what is done will be clearly reflective of the local situation. But as a counterexample, I might give that, my observation is that farmers are trying to get the most output from their water resources, use the water wisely, not waste water. And while they may use different techniques for irrigation, sometimes that maybe not understood. Why isn't there more drip irrigation in one area versus another? They're all operating to be water efficient and use their water wisely. There may be exceptions, but in general, you see similar practices. But yes, the circumstances differ. And one of the things that I've done some studies on groundwater governance in the United States. And one of the key responses we got when we asked about kind of what are your concerns, and one of the concerns that some agency personnel voiced was not having the resources to necessarily ensure compliance with the existing regulations as they are. And so something that may vary may depend on the economics of an area in terms of, are the agencies supported fully so that they can enforce certain regulations against water theft, or are the utilities able to charge rates so that they can deal with leakage problems, as just one example. So, water is very individualized, and when it comes to groundwater, it's very local. And so I guess part of it is going to be very local, but there are certainly common experiences. I'm not sure that's fully responsive to the question, but that's the best I can do.
No, that's great. That's great. We're just going to close out with one last question, and that's there's been a couple of questions about COVID-19, and just asking what your thoughts are about the impact of this pandemic on some of the discussions you've seen. Obviously, you've talked about that somewhat, but also on infrastructure decisions. One person here mentions would water, a public partnership of water and sanitation infrastructure, would that play a key role? Or do you see anything changing, and what are your thoughts on that?
I'm not sure I'm in the best position to answer that. I think, though, I'll refer back to what I said earlier when I was discussing the Navajo Nation situation. And that is that some analysis, some very knowledgeable people have shown that the water availability is a key factor in the incidence and the implications of COVID-19 on the Navajo Nation. Now, those water issues, they were there before, but they're being highlighted, and some monies are being made available by the federal government, and there's talk about more money being available and maybe water infrastructure being part of it. We know that we have in this country trillions of dollars of need for improvements to water infrastructure. In our state, it's common that water utilities have a leakage rate and lost and unaccounted for water rate of 10% or less, well under 10%. Other parts of the country, it's still bordering on 30%. Other parts of the world, it's bordering on 50, 60%. And so the issues of water quality, water systems, they're there, and COVID-19 may make us aware of them more than we have been. And we just need to keep that attention to it. I think as we've been trying to do in our weekly wave, put out stories about what different communities may be doing or what different studies are showing. I think understanding that treatment technologies can be good at getting rid of viruses and bad things is maybe something we'll understand better out of this. So, you know, there are always going to be some positives that come out of heightened awareness, maybe for bad reasons, heightened awareness. And so I think that we just don't want to lose the momentum of the questions being asked and the possible opportunities to address them. So.
Right. That's great. Thank you very much. I would like to thank you very much for coming here today, and all the way from your office.
Thank you.
Well, it's just a pleasure. It's really fun to have you here on the show. I'm going to do a little bit of a few statements to our public, and if you'll just hang on, I'll say a final thank you. I would like to thank all of you out there in webinar land for joining us today. It's great to have you here, and it has been really fun to do these webinars over the last couple months. I hope it's brightened your day and given you something to think about and talk about with your cohorts. We are out for the summer, but we're not done, because we have our conference, as Sharon mentioned. This conference will be entirely virtual. It'll be over a 2-day span, sort of in the afternoon of one day, following through to the morning of the next day. And there it is, right up there. And we're going to have some fun virtual happy hours in the evening between the two, or the late afternoon between the two. We're going to have polling, very likely, if we're working out all the details right now, and we're going to have a lively question and answer period for each seminar, or each section of the conference. So we're pretty excited. We should have the agenda posted pretty soon. We're just getting some final confirmation from several of our speakers. Don't forget our weekly wave, as Sharon mentioned. We put out a weekly wave, as the name would indicate, weekly. In the summer, we're going to be doing it every other week. We call that our summer wave, but that won't start until July. So you can depend on us for all kinds of water news every week on Friday until then. Let's see if there's any. We had over 150 people today. And I would like to thank Sharon once more for coming here. Dr. Megdal, it's just excellent to have you here. And from all of us at the Water Center, have a great day. And we like to use our slogan, greater depth, broader perspective for a clear water future. Have a great day.